Japan can be considered to be the birthplace of modern video gaming, and I'm here in Akihabara, the mecca for nerds, to find out what is wrong with the Japanese gaming industry.
The video game industry in Japan is one of the world's largest, and more than half of the population play video games, which is pretty crazy, considering the average age of Japan is somewhere between 127 and 9001.
But if gaming has such a long history in here, and so many people play them, where are all the Japanese esports players?
For an average gamer, it might be an impossible task to name a single Japanese pro gamer, unless of course you're a huge fan of fighting games. The reason why there are no Japanese pro gamers out there in the world of esports are multiple and honestly quite surprising and interesting.
I'm going to start with a bold statement. Japanese people don't own computers. In my time, I think I've seen 2 people who own a desktop computer. You have to be a huge nerd to own a desktop computer in Japan. You want proof? Am I in Japan? Yep, I am. Do I own a desktop computer? Yes I do. Am I a huge nerd? Yes I am.
And it's not only desktop computers that the Japanese don't have, since only 59% of the people own a desktop or a laptop, which is quite a low number compared to the America, for example, where 80% of adults own a desktop or a laptop. It is understandable that Japanese households don't usually have desktops, since after all, space is limited.
I guess this doesn't really spark joy. I think it's sort of silly.
But since laptops don't take up much space, it can't be the only reason. Some people have argued that one of the reasons why computer usage never caught up in Japan like in the West is because of keyboards. Japanese language has thousands of kanji, and they wouldn't all fit on a keyboard. So, while the West was practicing using a typewriter, the Japanese preferred to write by hand, which eventually gave the Westerners an advantage once the modern computer came to the offices.
Since most esports titles are played on the PC, it is understandable that in a country where PCs aren't as common, there aren't too many players for those titles either. But there are still over 100 million Japanese who own a computer and would be able to play those titles. So, what's stopping them from doing so?
Most people who play video games in Japan prefer to play them on either PlayStation or the Nintendo. They are Japanese gaming consoles after all, so it is understandable that Japanese people want to support local companies. So, if a game title is on both PC and PlayStation, most people prefer to play it on their PlayStation. A good example is Apex Legends, that is now extremely popular in here and everyone plays it. But they all play it on their PlayStations. In general, Japan has a large domestic market and preference to play their own games on their own language. This is why not many popular IPs from the outside ever gain footing in here.
I actually kind of hate telling people I play video games in here because the conversation always ends up me trying to explain what Dota and World of Warcraft and Counter-Strike are. So now I always just tell people I play online games and they always ask, oh, like Apex? And I'm just like, yeah, something like that. Somewhat related to this is that I still cannot wrap my mind around that I haven't found a single Japanese person who knows what Game of Thrones is. And not that it's, so amazing that, everyone must have seen it, but when it was huge, it was so huge, you couldn't escape it anywhere. Like, I literally felt like I was the only one who had not seen it. Just like Squid Game. But Squid Game was popular for like a month. Game of Thrones had that same thing going on for years. And then you come here, and it's like it never existed.
As you can see, it is extremely hard to penetrate the Japanese market. So if a game wants to be successful in Japan, it has to be on their consoles, in their own language, and preferably from a Japanese company. And there aren't many popular esports titles that fit the criteria.
And even if a game is successful enough to become a hit in Japan and wants to grow an esports scene, it isn't as easy as one would hope it would be.
You see, Japan has stupidly strict gambling laws, and with all of the lawmakers being old conservative people, esports is still seen and regulated as gambling rather than sports. This means it is extremely difficult for any organizer to come up with a prize pool for the players, which naturally doesn't incentivize people to follow esports as a career path. Trying to become a pro at Counter-Strike while also having to work 16 hours at the office every day to make ends meet is downright impossible. Which is why parents also aren't supportive of such a decision, even if a kid shows promise.
Only fighting games have been able to so far create pro-Japanese players because they fit into those criteria of being in Japanese language, being on the console, and made by local companies. But more importantly, the reason why Japanese players have been able to become so good at them, even in this suppressive landscape, is because of the community which started in the arcade.
You see, arcades are everywhere in Japan, and they have been a popular spot for people to hang out in and play video games together since the beginning of modern gaming. Kids used to go to the arcades to play against each other after school every day, and actually still do, because arcades are surprisingly still popular to this day in Japan. In these arcades, people made friends and enemies, played together and against each other, and formed communities around video games. In here were the first fighting game tournaments held back in the day, and if you fought your way to be the best Tekken player in the arcade, you were a local legend. It was extremely easy to find opponents to fight in an arcade, compared to playing alone in home like most of us had to do in the West. Which is why Japanese players were much better at playing against other people, and thus having historically been extremely good in most fighting games. After all, playing against good opponents is always the best practice. Japan was also much ahead with online matches when it came to many fighting game titles. From early 2000s, many arcades had an online network where you could connect with players from other arcades and play against them. In the West, on the other hand, online play in most fighting games didn't happen really until 10 years later with the help of Xbox Live and PlayStation Network. This is why Japanese have been able to reign supreme in the landscape of fighting games throughout the years, and only lately we in the West have been able to reach their level in Street Fighter.
But I don't see the opposite of happening in other gaming titles, which means that a Japanese team won't be winning League tournaments anytime soon. Unless, of course, League is translated into Japanese and released on Nintendo Switch. Even then though, I think the Japanese would be playing that Switch League with a controller, and from my personal experience, playing with a controller doesn't give a competitive advantage. Things are slowly changing though, surprisingly thanks to VTubers.
VTubers are extremely popular in Japan, and since most of their content relies on playing and trying out new video games, the average Japanese is now more than ever before being introduced to new game titles that they would have never heard of before. This has made many young people consider buying a gaming PC, so they can themselves also play the games that are popular among VTubers. This can be seen with the rising number of Japanese Steam users and PC gaming stores popping up in the city, like this one I found in Akihabara.
Change is slow though, but I do see a bright future for people like me who live in Japan and would like to play on local servers. Since, as of right now, I play World of Warcraft on the European servers, Diablo in the Korean servers, and Dota in the Philippine servers. So hopefully one day in the not so distant future we see more Japanese people playing PC games. This would also give an incentive to create Japan-only servers, and maybe through that we can finally start seeing Japanese people in the esports scene.